time, we went over Bentham's style of utilitarianism. We went over especially his calculus and how the calculus can be used to analyze consequences of actions to determine whether an action increases utility or not. Now, utilitarianism in general and Bentham's approach more specifically um, um, has been criticized in many ways. There are many criticisms leveled against uh, 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 against Bentham's approach specifically. One of the perhaps famous criticisms that I want to share with you, maybe now before we proceed to Mill, is the trolley case. You know, like so what is the trolley case? The trolley case is a case that can be spun in many ways or many. Let me put my own spin on it. Imagine a self-driving car. You know what a self-driving car is, right? Imagine a self-driving car. Self-driving car, right? A car that doesn't need a driver. And suppose that while the car on the road, a malfunction occurs. Malfunction in the car, like, I don't know, the brakes, let's say the brakes malfunction, the computer malfunctions. Now, the car, let's suppose that the car has an option. So that let's say that the car is in a part in the road. The car is actually on the move. But as a result of the failure, or as a result of the malfunction, the car has to make a decision. One has to make a choice. Either let's say hitting one person or crashing into a crowd of hundreds, right? So let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that there are no other options. That the car, you know, the car can't stop. It's malfunctioning. So either it has to hit one person or crash into crowds of hundreds. What would Bentham say?
Can I answer, Doctor?
Sorry?
Can I answer?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So basically, in the eyes of utilitarian people, they would definitely choose one person over a crowd of people because
Yeah,
losing one life is
yeah,
more
exactly.
suitable than losing like
Absolutely.
10 lives.
If the car is programmed, and imagine you're an engineer and program the car using Bentham's algorithm, if the car is programmed style utilitarianism, it will choose to hit one person rather than crowds, right? Because utility would be maximized that way. There will be less harm to utility if one person. And you know, many find this approach to be problematic. Approach that, you know, takes the greatest good, right, to be a principle that because in one way or another, this theory kind of claims that it would be reasonable to sacrifice the few for the sake of maximizing utility for the maximum number. This is what we call the greatest good principle, to sacrifice, that it would be reasonable to sacrifice the few for the sake of maximizing utility for the maximum number of persons. Many people would find this principle to be immoral, unethical, because it would treat people as instruments, as objects of manipulation, to be exploited, to be sacrificed for the sake of maximizing benefits to the maximum number of individuals. I don't know, guys, about your intuition, but Baby Teresa's example would also, I guess, remember Baby Teresa's? Baby Teresa's would also, the discussion about Baby Teresa's would also involve questions about utility and the greatest good and so forth. Yeah, but maybe we can later discuss the validity of utilitarianism. Let me in the meantime move on to discuss John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill, guys, was a 19th century philosopher who was influenced also by utilitarianism. His father was utilitarian, so he grew up on the principles of utilitarianism. In fact, guys, his father educated him. He received home education at the hands of his father because his father believed that home education would be the best way to maximize utility and benefit for individuals. So Mill grew up being a utilitarian, but when he was an adult, he kind of started asking questions about the validity of Bentham's approach. So consequently, he developed his own approach to utilitarianism. He's still a utilitarian, but he kind of diverged from Bentham. Mill, guys, distinguishes between two kinds of pleasure. Two kinds of pleasure. What are they, two kinds, guys? Intellectual pleasures and physical pleasures. Okay, what's the difference between intellectual pleasures and physical pleasures? Intellectual pleasures are pleasures that the human mind receive or enjoy by virtue of the intellect or by virtue of the mind. There are pleasures that depend primarily on the mind, on the soul, on the intellect, such as, like what, guys? Rinat?
Like reading, maybe.
Like pleasures of reading, pleasures of music, because music, at least some kinds of music, would be intellectual pleasure, would involve intellectual pleasure. Science, pleasures of doing science, pleasures of math, pleasures of doing math, solving problems, poetry, literature, yes, anything related to the mind. Physical pleasures, however, are pleasures that the human mind receives by virtue of the body primarily. Physical pleasures are primarily pleasures that depend on the human body, on the body, right? Such as, easy, come on, guys, such as what, Anhal? Pleasures of eating, sex, what else? Sorry?
Yeah,
Drinking.
but someone said it. I want to say sexual desires or something like that.
Sports. Sports would go here.
Clothes.
So basically, yeah, any pleasures that primarily arise from bodily sensations. Okay.
Doctor, can we say like not completely, but in a somehow materialistic pleasures or materialistic
Yeah, you could, as long as you identify the material as physical or bodily. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Mill argues that these two kinds of pleasures don't have the same value, that they're not equal in terms of utility and value. To Mill, one of these pleasures is of higher value and utility than the other. Which one? Intellectual or physical? Intellectual.
Sure.
Yeah. According to Mill, intellectual pleasures, sorry, I answered that, are of higher value and utility than physical pleasures because the consequences of intellectual pleasures, their ramification, their impact, their consequences would be of higher value than physical pleasures. Let me clarify. It's not like Mill is saying that physical pleasures are not important or don't matter. No, of course not. He just is saying that the intellectual pleasures have higher value, higher utility than physical pleasures, while admitting that physical pleasures are of value as well. Okay, related to the distinction between intellectual and physical is a distinction between quality and quantity. The quality of pleasure and the quantity of pleasure. By quality of pleasure, Mill meant, what do you think he meant by qualities of pleasure? Quality. By qualities of pleasure, he meant the way the pleasures, feel, the way the pleasures affect the persons. Yeah, it has to do with the way, or the way the pleasures affect the persons, right? And put differently, the way when we speak about quality means the way the pleasures feel or appear to the persons involved. By quantity of pleasure is meant simply the number or amount of pleasures. Right? It's just simply the amount, the numbers. And what do you think, guys? Which is more important? Yeah, Abdurrahman, I think that's the way you put it. That praise, the pleasures of praise has to do with the quality, depending on the praise itself, but it has to do with the quality of the pleasure, the way the pleasure feels or appears, rather than the number, right? So maybe one kind of praise would be of a more significant quality in terms of pleasure than numbers and amounts of sensual pleasures. Okay, I was saying which is more valuable? Which of the two has more utility? Quality of pleasure or quantity? Obviously, quality. Mill is of the view that utility would be best maximized when we consider the qualities of pleasures rather than the quantities of pleasures, right? And I think you can all now see, right, the link. Qualities of pleasure or qualitative pleasure would be identified with intellectual pleasures, right? Mainly. Whereas quantities of pleasures, mainly, with of course with exceptions, would be identified with physical pleasures or bodily pleasures, right? So Mill is in a sense arguing that utility, maximization of utility, ultimately depends on the presence of intellectual pleasures that are of quality rather than amounts or numbers or quantities of physical pleasures. Again, he's not denying the value of physical pleasures and quantities of physical pleasures, but his argument is that when it comes to utility and when it comes to utility, we should give higher value to qualities of pleasures, to intellectual pleasures, than physical pleasures, than quantities of physical pleasures. So I have an example in mind. Maybe let me see, can you give me an example of how qualities of pleasure, qualitative pleasures, intellectual pleasures are of more significant value? So suppose you're enjoying an opera. I know maybe some of you like opera. Imagine you're enjoying an opera performance, let's say for 3 hours. Now the enjoyment of the performance, if you like opera, enjoyment would be of quality and intellectual kind that by far outweighs quantities of physical pleasures. So even if the opera is enjoyed for 3 hours, it would be still superior or higher in value and utility than perhaps 24 hours of quantities of physical pleasures. Guys, are you following? Did you get my?
Yes, doctor.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
It's the difference between Mill and Bentham is very obvious actually.
Right.
No, Bentham is more.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
I couldn't hear you very well. Okay, thank you.
No, I was just saying.
So basically, like Bentham is more. Yeah, Bentham is more into acts. However, in Mill's view, you can say that there are certain rules to abide by, like intellectual pleasures and physical pleasures, and one is superior to another. So it's more into a rule utilitarian than an act utilitarian.
Since you brought it, would Mill agree on this kind of calculus? Not really, because this calculus kind of presupposes that a quantitative measure of pleasure. It kind of ignores quality of pleasures. It doesn't factor in qualities of the qualities of pleasures are not factored in because the focus here is on quantities of pleasure. So naturally, Mill would reject the pleasure calculus, because the pleasure calculus, Bentham's pleasure calculus, kind of presupposes a quantitative measure of pleasures, ignoring qualitative pleasure. So yeah, they're different, definitely. And in addition, they're different in regards to other points that maybe Anhal pointed out at. Mill has this famous saying that it is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. Hadi wrote, pleasure can't be measured. Well, yeah, but remember Hadi, Bentham thought that pleasure can be calculated. Why? Because Bentham took a quantitative approach to pleasures. Hadi? So exactly, Mill would disagree with that. Did you get the point? So what does this sentence mean? It is better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. What it means really that happiness should not be defined in terms of physical satisfaction, in terms of bodily satisfaction, in terms of bodily contentment, right? But happiness, rather to Mill, is to be defined in terms of pursuing, in terms of looking for intellectual pleasures. Which means that even if intellectual pleasures are difficult to satisfy, so it's difficult to satisfy intellectual pleasures such as truth, knowledge, even if it's difficult to satisfy, yet they are to be preferred to they are to be preferred to pleasures that can be physically satisfied or bodily satisfied. So what he means here, it's better to be a person like Socrates, you know, the philosopher Socrates, who seeks intellectual pleasures. It's better to be this kind of person who seeks intellectual pleasures, even if the seeking of intellectual pleasures might leave you dissatisfied. It's better to be this kind of person than a person who cares only about physical pleasures. So the satisfied pig here is a symbol for a person who cares only about physical pleasures, right? Did you guys get the quote? Did you get the meaning of, yeah, and clearly, guys, Bentham would not agree to that, because to Bentham, what matters is the maximization of numbers of utility, right? Quantity, right? Bentham simply defines happiness in terms of contentment, in terms of satisfaction of pleasures, numbers of pleasures, regardless of quality. If you're still wondering why Mill preferred intellectual, qualitative pleasures of physical, let me give you another example. Which of the two would have far-reaching consequences to human life? Science, just to give it, science, or let's say physical pleasures?
Doctor, can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, I was saying which would have more powerful consequences in regards to human life? So I gave an example: science, let's say medicine, or let's say sports, or activities involving physical, which would have more tremendous consequences to human life? I think
Definitely.
would
Science.
agree. Science, medicine. I mean, think of the consequences of medicine and science, and how they improved the lives of human beings over life. So, in terms of consequences, science, medicine have far more reaching consequences to the lives of human beings than activities activities that involve physical pleasures, right? Now, both are important. Obviously, sport is important. All activities involving physics are valuable, but when you want to compare, according to Mill, you would realize that intellectual pleasures have far more reaching consequences. And remember, Mill is a consequentialist. They have far more reaching consequences than activities that simply rely on physical satisfaction. Again, it's not like Mill is saying that sports are not valuable. It's not like saying that eating is not pleasurable, and so he's not denying that. He's just saying that we need to have clear guidelines, right, on which pleasures, which is more valuable, or which is of higher utility. Guys, are you following? Mill has actually an argument, an argument to justify his preference of intellectual pleasures over. It goes something like this: most people who had experienced all kinds of pleasures would consider qualitative pleasures to be of higher value than physical pleasures. So, so this is a kind of hypothetical argument. If we were to ask persons who experience all kinds of pleasures, and if we were to ask Socrates, Plato, the people who had the chance to experience them all, because Socrates and Plato were also into physical pleasures, right? It's not like they spend their time doing philosophy only without physical pleasures. So if we were to ask these kinds of persons which pleasures they preferred most, it would be reasonable to expect that they would say that they prefer intellectual pleasures over physical pleasures. So I guess this is the hypothetical argument from the experts. Who would be the expert? The experts are the guys who kind of experienced it all, who had it all. If we were to ask these guys, it would be reasonable to expect that they would say they prefer intellectual over physical. The problem with this argument is that it's a kind of hypothetical argument, right? So we don't know exactly what they would say. So it's just a kind of a hypothetical expectation of what these supposed experts would say. Did you guys get the argument? Yeah, so I have an image here. So Mill is like, Mill is kind of saying that morality And actually, this is his words. Morality should not be pig morality. Morality is not a pig morality. It's not a morality that should be concerned with quantities of physical pleasures. That's not morality. True morality, according to Mill, is to place higher value on intellectual pleasures, on qualitative intellectual pleasures. So really, Mill is, is posing a question to us regarding to the kind of persons we want to be, whether we want to be persons who give higher value to physical pleasures to give higher value to intellectual pleasures than physical pleasures, or persons who treat all pleasures alike, like Bentham. Remember, Bentham treated all pleasures alike because because he cared about numbers and quantities of pleasures. So it's something for you to think about. And actually, in his book on liberty, Mill has a neat argument, a thought experiment, kind of to push his position further. I'm not sure I have the time to share the argument with you, but maybe if we get time, we'll get back to it later. I want to finish with recent developments in utilitarianism. In the 20th century, the 21st century, utilitarianism, evolved and developed into two main camps: act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. And Hal already kind of mentioned. Okay, now don't worry. What's the difference between the two? Okay, first, according to act utilitarianism, utility is defined in relation to individual acts only and their consequences. So to act utilitarians, when it comes to deciding whether an act is good or not, all we need to consider is the act and its consequences. In other words, there's nothing else to consider other than the act and its consequences. Utility is evaluated in connection to acts and their consequences. Nothing to consider other than the act and its consequences. I actually wrote that point. Rule utilitarians, however, take a more elaborate, complex approach. Rule utilitarians claim that utility is defined or should be defined in relation to supposed consequences that would follow from acting or not acting on the basis of rules. Utility is determined in connection to those rules. So what true utilitarians do is to introduce the notion of rules. Rules. And whether an act is good or not will be determined by what and how. Will be determined by whether there is a rule that approves it or not. So, rule utilitarian imagine persons or agents to have a number of rules that should govern their actions. And these rules determine which actions are approved and which actions are not approved. Now, what are these rules? Okay, let me clarify. These rules are not the given rules in society. They're not the traditional rules. They're not the institution rules. They're not the They're not the rules present in institutions, in the state, in government, in society. So think rather about think of these rules as theoretical rules, rules that the agent would have theoretically. Think of these rules as rules that would be posited or present in the mind of persons because they are rules that maximize utility. Yeah. So really, what rule utilitarians mean by rules, they don't mean any kind of rules. They rather mean like theoretical rules, rules of the theory that are posited because they maximize. Yes, they maximize utility. So rules are not any rules, but rules that maximize utility only. Rule utilitarians emphasize the kind of rules we should follow as agents to maximize utility. When we judge a situation like Baby Teresa's or the driving car, the self-driving car, we should appeal to these rules to judge which action is good or not. And I leave you here with this question in this page. Which of the two is stronger, as in more demanding or time consuming? Rule utilitarianism or act utilitarianism? Which of the two approaches is more demanding than the other? More demanding as in requiring you to spend time. Which of the two? Rule? Lama says rule. Actually, Lama, act. Yeah, sorry, act. Why Lama? It's more Lama. It's more demanding because every time you want to make a decision, Lama, you have to run the calculations on your own. Yeah, because you have rules to appeal to. Yeah, sorry.
I thought about it this way, like, isn't it because you have to think of the rules and then work based upon them, like that?
Let me just, yeah, okay, I know, I think this is what you meant, but let me explain. Act utilitarianism is more demanding because every time you want to make a decision, you have to run through the calculus, through Bentham's calculus. You know, remember last time, the calculations to decide what would be the best course of action. And that's time consuming, right? It takes time. Rule utilitarian, why? Because you don't have rules to appeal to, Lama. Yeah? It's like the person, the act, and the consequences. In case of rule utilitarianism, however, you don't have to do that. All you need, Lama, is to consider the rules that are present in you, in your mind. So the rules would be already there, right? Posited by the theory. So by theoretically at least. So all you need is to appeal to the rules that you already have. You don't need to formulate these rules, right? They're already there, right? And so all you need is to see if a given action is approved or not by the rules that you have in your mind. And of course, you're right. The formulation of these rules would take time, but but again, the rules would be formulated by the community, by the agents collectively over time, right? Over a period of time. So they're already there, right? So we don't need to formulate them every time we want to make decisions, right? Did you get the point? Bentham, guys, Bentham is closer to whom? To rule or act? Bentham. Bentham is your model of truth.
Act.
And how knows the answer? Act, definitely. Bentham is act. No rules. Mill, I guess Mill, you can argue, is closer to rule utilitarianism than act. Why? Because Mill, I guess, would admit that intellectual pleasures could be the foundation of a number of rules, a number of rules that should govern the moral life of agents, such as, for example, that human beings should care about their dignity, about their intellect, about their intelligence, right? Just to mention an example of a rule that I guess Mill would stand by, that no person should no person should ignore her intellect, her intelligence, her mind, her reason, right? And I know I meant we have time. Let me leave you with this thought experiment. I like Mel. His thought, I think you would like this thought. Imagine somebody offers you a deal. You know, deal, a fishy deal. Okay, the deal will be the following. The deal consists of us, giving up handing in to the guy our mind, our intelligence, our reason. In return for receiving happiness. Happiness as physical happiness. And mental challenges. What would you do? Would you accept this deal? And maybe it's time to ask you guys, would you take this deal? You get eternal happiness, money, physical pleasures, food, but in return of giving up one's mind, one's intelligence, and one's dignity, one's pride. Would you take this deal, guys? Did you get the challenge? Of course not. Yeah, and it's but notice Bentham. The trick is Bentham, I guess, wouldn't mind it because utility would be maximized, right? Utility would be maximized on the deal, right? But you maximize quantitatively. But Mill would say, even so, even if there is maximization of quantities of pleasure, that is not the right thing to do because it is just not right to give up one's dignity, one's mind, one's intelligence. Yeah. Yes. And I like this thought experiment. Just because it kind of it challenges us to think about the meaning of morality and what it means to be a moral person, right? And to what extent people would be like, willing to sell their soul. It's like a selling of one's soul, right? Like the myth of Faust, right? You've heard of the myth of Faust? The guy who sold his soul to the devil. Have you ever heard of? Probably you've heard of Faust, right? Tab guys, any questions? on utilitarianism? Did you like, okay, comparing utilitarianism to virtue theory, which theory you liked more, Aristotle's or utilitarianism?
Doctor, I have a question before
Yeah.
answering this question. Okay, basically, just to gather my thoughts, John Stuart Mill doesn't really care about maximizing utility, more like into equality, you know, because he
But he
set certain pillars.
he does. Okay,
Yeah,
no, that's a good point. He does care. No, Mill is a utilitarian. He's a consequentialist. But
yeah, he is.
he does argue that maximization of utility would be best performed by giving more weight to intellectual pleasures, to qualitative pleasures.
Okay.
So that's the trick. So he is consequentialist, but he disagrees with Bentham's style of consequentialism. Type any questions? And how I asked you guys, Patricia, whom do you prefer more, Mill, Bentham, or Aristotle? I mean, this is your opinion. Mill. Jana goes for Mill. Mill, yeah. How about Aristotle? Do you see the difference between Mill and Aristotle? I mean, they are similar. They are similar in some respects, but yet different in many other respects, right? Any questions, guys? Folks? Aristotle is a bit utopian. Yeah, he's maybe not utopian, but he is perhaps too optimistic about the human potential. Yeah.
Actually, Doctor, regarding the human,
Mill is also optimistic, right? Mill is also optimistic in some sense, right? They're both optimistic. They're both optimistic. Maybe you can say Aristotle is more optimistic than, but they're both optimistic. Sorry, somebody had a question?
yeah, I was just saying that both of them used reason to a certain extent, but
Right.
Bentham was pure rational and pure reasonable in his arguments, you know? So, yeah, he wasn't that too optimistic.
Right. Yes, I think it's enough for today. I was gonna say, guys, Thursday we'll review the midterm. I'll give you a sample of how to analyze an ethical case. The midterm, as I mentioned in my email, will be only on virtue theory and utilitarianism, right? Yes, midterm July 6th. Did you receive my email, Hadi? You are on the email, yes. Type, guys, let me take attendance. I'm going to create a poll. And thank you, guys. Once you write your names, you can leave. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.